Hello and welcome everyone. I'd like to thank our sponsor for this event, which is the UNH Entrepreneurship Center, better known as the E-Center. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to introduce two alumni of UNH. First, Dave Cody, class of 1976, former CEO of Honeywell, who'll talk about his new book, Winning Now and Winning Later. Interviewing David will be another alum, Susan Mercandetti, class of 75, former editor of Penguin Random House, and former vice president of ABC News. And both Dave and Susan are great examples of engaged alumni who have enjoyed tremendous success. So let me start with Susan and say that Susan was a first-generation college student and also a first-generation American. Her parents were Italian immigrants. Her mother worked in a sweatshop and her father in a meatpacking plant. At UNH, Susan found her passion writing for the New Hampshire Channel, Channel 11, and for WUNH Radio. This led to her first job in the White House in the Ford administration, where she was creating news briefings. She then moved into news media and became a Nightline producer when it started in 1979. She's had a variety of wonderful positions at Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, Miramax, Penguin Random House, and ABC News. Susan is an innovative national leader in multimedia storytelling and management. She is a grateful UNH alum, devoted to giving back. And I will say from experience, Susan is also a terrific interviewer, so we're very fortunate to have her interviewing today. Dave Cody is a first-generation college student, first in his family actually to graduate from high school. He grew up in Suncook, New Hampshire, and I have done the work so you don't have to. Suncook is between Manchester and Concord. His dad owned a service station, working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And while attending UNH, Dave continued that work ethic by working full-time at a jet engine factory. This was good for his income, but bad for his grades, as it turns out. And somewhere along this time, Dave thought that maybe his career path was going to be in commercial fishing. It wasn't, and we're very happy that it wasn't. He returned to UNH and got much, in fact, almost infinitely better grades, I think, if you do the math. He then graduated, landed a full-time job at GE, and moved up the ranks, becoming eventually president and CEO of GE Appliances, which is just such a wonderful American institution, that business. Then he became the CEO of TRW, and in 2002, appointed CEO of Honeywell, which was in pretty bad shape at the time. Over the next 16 years, Honeywell's market cap grew from 20 billion to 120 billion. He was managing 132,000 employees spread over 100 countries. And the stock value rose by over 800% during his tenure, beating the S&P index by 2.5 times. The list of accomplishments is too great even to summarize, but he was elected director of Federal Reserve Bank of New York, selected by President Obama to be on the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. And you might think, this story sounds like a Horatio Alger novel. And in fact, he was named to the Horatio Alger Association of Distinguished Americans, and you can't make that up, so I had to say that. Then he is leadership and executive chairman at Verge Holdings. He did it all with an approach that he shares in his new book, which I am reading and enjoying very much, Winning Now, Winning Later. So I'm eager to hear this conversation, honored to welcome back two wonderful alums, David and Susan. And Susan, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Boy, Dave, that's impressive, huh? I gotta say, I loved this book. I really did. I don't read business books. I didn't read the business books I had to work on at Random House. But I loved it for a few reasons. You write like you speak, and people who know you and have read this book know that it is refreshingly blunt, and you are amazingly honest. So I love that about it. And I also love the fact that its implications go far beyond the business community. I personally am never going to run a company at this point in my life, but I took so many valuable lessons away from this. Even for a educational community like UNH, and community leaders and families, and personally, I really got a lot out of this book. I read it. Thought I was pretend to read it, like read the front and the back, but I actually read the book. You can quiz me. And it's very dog-eared. And we'll get into the book, I promise. So I know your publisher will be happy about that. But since we're here with our UNH friends and our New Hampshire friends and beyond, there are people, I understand there's someone even from Croatia. But tell us something we don't know about you. Tell us about your roots in New Hampshire and how your family got there, and tell us a little bit about you, and more than go beyond what Jim told us. This nice interview and intro.
All right. Well, I'll certainly try. And a couple of comments first. As Susan, listening to your bio, it feels like I ought to be interviewing you rather than the other way around. So if that opportunity ever arises, count me in. The second one is I have a sister who still lives in New Hampshire and works there. So a shout out to her boss, Scout Asmus, who's, I believe, listening. And hopefully this will get my sister a raise when he listens to this. In terms of background, heavily French Canadian. So the namesake came to Quebec in 1634 from France. About 120 years ago or so, some of them moved down to Manchester, New Hampshire to work in the textile mills because we were the cheap labor then. And it kind of grew out from there. And I actually spoke French before I spoke English as a kid. Until I was about 3 years old, I spoke no English, which I find kind of interesting because I was, I don't know, third or fourth generation American at that point. And that's why when I read stories on immigration and they're appalled that people come here and a third generation is still speaking their initial language, I think, well, I kind of fit into that category and things worked out okay. We didn't have a lot of role models, as you might imagine, because it was just a small French-Canadian kind of enclave. And I mean, there were older people who still spoke only French, no English at all. And I still have that kind of French-Canadian heritage. And my grandkids called me Pepe rather than granddad or a grandpa or anything like that, because I liked preserving that heritage. I always enjoyed it. I was the first to graduate from high school, as Jim mentioned. So I know my mom has said many times that she wishes they could have been of more help in terms of guidance, but they just didn't know whether it was homework or career or what was possible. And an indication of that was I can remember between end of my junior year and St. Paul's in Concord. The guidance counselor pulled me aside and said, hey, St. Paul's has this 1 month curriculum in the summer, and they pick scholar athletes, and I played basketball at the time and was doing well enough in school, and they said they'd like you to attend. I remember I only grew up 5 miles from them, and my first question was, well, what's St. Paul's? And they explained it was a exclusive boarding school, and I had to ask, well, what's a boarding school? And he explained that, and I said, well, why do I want to do this? And he said, well, it's a good experience and you get a college credit out of it. I said, well, I'm most likely to go to UNH. It's the only place I can afford. And how many do you need to graduate? And he said, well, 128. And I said, well, that's one? I get one credit? I said, I'd rather work. I need to, I need to earn the money to be able to go to school. So I never did go. My mom didn't learn about it till like 20 years later when it came up to something. And she said, why didn't you say something? I said, I don't know. I'm a guy. Just don't talk about stuff, I guess. So I guess that would be an interesting little factoid that wasn't in the book.
For sure. So lazy, immature, and directionless. That's what you were. That's not my opinion. You write that in the book. How did you dig yourself out of that hole?
Oh, I had an epiphany. I was, as Jim mentioned, it took me 6 years to get through school. And I didn't do that well while I was there because I was pretty lazy, and I was smart enough to be able to get through classes without having to go to them and still do okay on the tests and stuff. So I quit twice between my high school and freshman year, and then again between my junior and senior years to become a commercial fisherman out of York Harbor. Maine. And one of my learnings with all this is that while I might be able to understand things, the chances of anything coming out of my hands as a mechanic, a carpenter, or a fisherman was not going to happen.
So you can't fix your car.
Could not. I couldn't fix my car. My carpentry sucked. My commercial fishing, we had as much money after 6 months as we started with. I mean, nothing really ever worked. So I got married like I can't say it was the smartest thing I ever did, but got married early because all my friends were. And we're living in a 3rd floor, unheated, uninsulated apartment in Suncook. So you know how cold New Hampshire can get.
Oh, man.
And first month, my wife comes home and says she's pregnant. And I said, well, how's that possible? You're taking the pill. And said, well, it happens. I said, okay, well, we can have our suspicions of how that happened, but it is what it is. Then 4th month, she said, I can't work anymore either. And I did the math and found out that on my take-home pay as an hourly employee running a punch press was about $2 less a week than what I was making. It was I was making $2 less a week than what we were spending, and then assume no gifts, no anything else. And I had $100 in the bank. So I figured, okay, I got 50 weeks to figure out what to do. And that's when I realized the only thing I was good at was school. And I darn well better finish school and do well and get myself a job that paid more. And I always tell my oldest son, he's the reason I'm successful, because he scared the bejesus out of me. I realized I had to get my act together. So I quit smoking. I started working out. I was going to school, working full time, and eventually got an exempt job at GE, and then just kind of built myself up from there. But he was my epiphany.
I hope you gave him a lot of credit for that as he was growing up.
Well, he's kind of funny. He'll when I do tell that story, and I probably tell it more often than he wants to hear, he'll grab himself by the lapels and say, yeah, I peaked early.
I love, what I loved in the book? I love that you said basically that being smart is not enough to achieve results. Is being smart overrated? And I ask this in the context of because we have so many, young people starting out. What do you look for? What do you look for in terms of smart versus grade point average versus, grit at Honeywell?
Yeah, it's, I wouldn't want to overread it. It's not that being smart doesn't help. It's just that too often people think getting good grades is all that's required. And yeah, being smart, getting good grades matters. But if you're going to be successful, there are other traits that you need to develop beyond that. Things like being able to work with other people, being able to develop good judgment, the ability to listen. And too often I run into people who are very bright, but kind of the old saying is they're the smartest person in the room. They spend all their time talking, none of their time really listening. And if they are appearing to listen, it's often because they're formulating their response to what you just said or what they think you're saying, as opposed to actually listening all the way through and actually thinking about what was just said. The ability to, say, make a decision, and then instead of looking for confirmation bias, looking for falsification bias. Was I right? Do I need to change something? Just basic drive, being able to work as hard as everybody else or harder so that they can all see it. Having common sense. It's amazing how uncommon common sense is. Being able to pull all those things together in a way that'll make you an effective leader matters a lot. And I see too many people who are really smart. Now, I suppose the other one I should add is independent thinking. And a line that you probably saw in the book is I'll say independent thinking is a lot more rare than being smart. And I run into lots of smart people who can explain why things are the way they are. They can explain how the herd is thinking because that's how they're thinking. But they don't really look at things themselves and say, okay, do I really believe this? I know I see the analysis, I see what people are saying, but kind of what's not said, what's a different way of looking at this. And all those abilities matter just as much as being smart if you're going to be a good and effective leader.
You talk about judgment. I love the subject of judgment, and I always wanted to commission a book on that subject. What is good judgment to you? Can you teach judgment? Do you, through osmosis, do you get judgment? Because that judgment is something we all need to be better at, and we all use every single day, or not.
I think it's a fascinating topic and not one that's generally taught anywhere. And I was always struck by this line that Harry Truman had, where he said, yeah, a lot of my decisions are controversial, but that's because all I get are the 51-49 decisions. All the 90-10 decisions are made long before they ever get to me. And that means you have to have a good sense for judgment. And when I look at how leadership is taught generally in classes, a lot of it has to do with motivation and how do you motivate a large group. And I always felt like when I saw that, that's really only 5% of the leadership job. And I always say there are three things required. One, you have to mobilize a large group. Most people like to think of that as, okay, you gave a great speech, and that's the most visible and what people look at. And I always said, well, all that proves is that you're a good orator. You can give a good speech. It doesn't mean you're a good leader, because the next two steps matter more. The second one, touching on judgment to the point you're talking about, which is, okay, how do you pick the right direction? Because if you motivate a large group of people and you spend 40 years wandering in the desert or working on stuff that doesn't matter, you're not a good leader. Then the third one is, okay, you've made that judgment, you've made your decision. How do you make sure that everybody is truly moving step by step in that direction? Those last two steps, I don't think ever get really taught as part of leadership. The first one really gets driven. When it comes to your question on how do you develop judgment, I think there could be more work done to teach it, to say, okay, a lot of 51-49 decisions. What do you look at? How do you decide what, say, ought to be overweighted versus what someone else says? How do you make sure you get all the facts and opinions out so that you can truly, as I like to say, form a mosaic? It's not as pretty as a painting, but you're trying to put all these pieces together to say, okay, what's the right decision overall? For me, the way I'd like to think I was able to develop it is I spent a lot of time watching. And I'd look at decisions that my boss made, that I'd read about, that other people had made in a business setting or connotation. And I'd try to judge for myself, okay, do I think that's a good decision or a bad decision, and why? And over time, you kind of watch, okay, did it work out well? Did it not work out well? And over time, you find yourself just getting better and better at it. One of the things that I talk about in the book on, say, how to be able to make better decisions, to drive better judgment, is how do you run a meeting? And I stumbled on this one later, and it was truly a stumble. And the line I ended up using was that as a leader, in order to make a good decision, it was important that I be right at the end of the meeting, not at the beginning of the meeting. And you think about how we all grow up. We start off as an individual contributor, and you have to look at the facts, develop a point of view, and then advocate for that point of view. Well, the higher up you go, the less you know about any particular topic, which means you have to find a way to pull it out of people and get their facts and opinions. Now, when you go to do that, now you're dealing with a lot of human nature and human dynamics. Introverts and extroverts participate differently. Men and women participate differently. Human nature participates differently, because if you advocate for a point of view up front or say, hey, here's what I think we ought to do, you'll get a third of the people for you right from the beginning, a third of people against you right from the beginning, and a third who just don't care. They just want a decision. Well, if you give them, here's what I'm thinking, you immediately galvanize people into those three categories. And you don't take that time to really draw them out and find out what exactly are they thinking. And by doing all these things, you develop better judgment.
Can you be specific about, say, how men and women in your organization handled a problem, an issue, or dealt with a decision that had to be made? Did you see a difference? We're all getting washed out here with the light. I apologize.
Yeah, not a problem. Well, I would say I was really struck by a book I read about, I guess 25 or 30 years ago, called Men and Women in Conversation by Deborah Tannen. And all of us have a tendency, I think, to look at things from our own viewpoint, as in, well, this is how I participate, so this is how everybody must participate. And you end up learning, like I said, same thing with introverts and extroverts, that it's different. And unless you can find a way to draw those people out, it doesn't work. And what I found with women, for example, it's really kind of interesting. You hear the old joke all the time about how a woman says something, and because of her tone of voice or the way it comes across, it doesn't really resonate with everybody. And then literally 5 minutes later, a man says the same thing, maybe with a few different words, and everybody goes, oh yeah, that's, I think that's right. And, my wife points that out to me all the time about how that happened to her.
It's called
heat aerospace industry.
There's a word for it, heat eating.
Oh, is that? No, I didn't know that. But she was in the aerospace industry, heavily male dominated. And she had that happen to her all the time. And it was very frustrating. So if you're aware of it, you end up, I think, becoming a better listener, because you have to really listen to what everybody says and not tone or how it comes across, but really listen to what was said and listen to it all the way through. And it was a nice piece of advice I got 20 years ago or so from someone who said, always listen to the question all the way to the end, then wait 5 seconds before responding to make sure that you've really internalized what the question was or what the comment was. And if you find yourself doing that, it just, like I said, makes you a much more effective leader. It takes a little work in the beginning because you're kind of overcoming your 20 years of tendencies or whatever, but it does work. Okay,
you listen to this all the way through. You're one of the most successful people to come out of New Hampshire. I put Daniel Webster in that sense. And you've written this book, and it's a great book. And what you've accomplished is astonishing. Did you ever screw up? I mean, I don't mean in school. I mean, did you ever make like a seriously bad decision in business?
I wouldn't say it was, nothing so bad that it killed me, obviously. I would say one, I've got a couple. I'd say one is why I ended up getting fired from GE in the first place. So I'd had a good 25-year track record. And then Jack Welch asked to have dinner with me. So I went, and this was June of '99. And he said, Dave, I want you out of the company by year end. And I said, oh, okay, well, what did you see that you didn't like, or did you not see that you wish you had? And his voice elevated, and he said, you don't understand. I want you out of the company by year end. I said, no, I get it. I just think I'm better than you think I am. And if there's something I need to address, I'd like to know what it is. His voice elevated again. He said, you don't understand. You need to be out by year end. And I said, okay, I got it. I mean, I never did find out. But one of my learnings from that was he was a much more emotional leader than I ever realized. And I thought it was just his shtick, that it was a way for him to get things done. And I never realized it until afterwards, when everything was all done and I was leaving. And I said, well, okay, that was a mistake. This is something I never realized. I just assumed he was a certain way because that's how a leader in his position must be. And he wasn't. And eventually that got me fired. Now, interestingly, I've heard from a lot of mutual friends after that he regretted it, which was nice to hear. But I would say that was definitely a career mistake. You could say things worked out just fine, but I mean, who knows how things would have worked out otherwise. I would also say, and I go through this in the book, where I didn't follow my own advice. And I embarked on this Six Sigma approach, the same way that I had been schooled in it. And it didn't work at GE where I was at the time. Yet I went and did the same darn thing. And I wasted 10 years or so of effort and people's time that could have been much more effectively spent. And I looked at that and said, okay, that was a mistake. I didn't listen to my own advice. If I'd paid attention, that falsification bias, that falsification facts were everywhere. And I just didn't look. I didn't listen. And that was a mistake. But again, none of these killed it overall, but I certainly did have my own share of mistakes in there.
You tell the story about your dad, who was a big influence in your life. And one day you were sitting at the gas station with him, and he got reamed out by a customer. And he had a lesson for you about putting your pride in your back pocket. CEOs have a reputation of what? I don't know, big egos. Do you think that's fair? How did you keep yours in your back pocket?
Well, that was a story that you could tell it really stuck with me. I can't remember whether I was 12 or 14. I would lean towards 12. And my dad was not the sort of guy to be trifled with by anybody. And that included all of us kids. So, I mean, if you had a question, you got your answer, even if it was, you don't need to know that. And that was it. So when this customer came in and was yelling at him, I thought, oh man, I'm going to watch my dad pop him right here. I can't believe it. And all he kept doing was saying, I'm sorry, I'll fix it. I'll take care of it. And he came and sat down next to me, and I thought, well, I'm not saying a darn thing right now. I'm just keeping my mouth shut. And he just kind of wistfully looked off and said, you know, Dave, sometimes in life and business, you got to put your pride in your back pocket. And nothing more than that. And I didn't ask him anything about it either. This is a good time to keep quiet. I would say anybody who gets to any kind of leadership position has to have some kind of ego. To say that no leader has an ego of any kind, I think would be a mistake. Your point is the right one, is that, okay, I have an ego, but how do I make sure that my ego doesn't step on everybody else? And this is where I go back to the things like, so how do you lead? How do you run a meeting? And it has to begin with a certain humility that says, while I have an ego, I don't know everything. And I don't know what the right thing is to do all the time. And you have to back off a little bit and say, my job as a leader is not to always know the right thing to do, but to say, okay, with whatever I'm dealing with, how do I make a good decision? Because as a leader, you don't get measured on whether you were right from the very beginning. You get measured on, did you make a good decision or not? And if you start to keep that objective in mind and say, okay, my job is to make a good decision. It's not to be viewed as, yeah, you know, we just go to Dave and we'll find out what it is we got to do. Then it starts to cause you to approach the job differently and to recognize that if you've got good people, which you should always strive to do, you got to find a way to bring out the best in them so that you can make the best decision.
And there are a lot of good examples of that in the book, which I found enormously entertaining and interesting. I wouldn't want to be on the other side of you. So winning now, winning later. Expand on that basic premise of the book, that companies can do seemingly two contradictory things at the same time. Just talk about the premise.
Yeah, I'd say I first became aware of this about, let's say, 30 years ago. And I was tasked as the CFO at the time with running an inventory reduction task force. And I'd seen enough of these with other people doing them to note that they all failed. Inventory would go down and then things would go bad and it'd come flying back in, so that it was totally ineffective. And it was one of the guys on our team, the team that I'd assembled, who said, because my comment was, we may fail, but I want to fail differently. I don't want to do the same thing everybody else has done and fail the same way. And his comment, he was, I don't know, like 64 years old at the time. And some people didn't have a high regard for him. I did. And he said, where this always falls apart is inventory does go down, but customer delivery suffers. The sales force complains, and then all the inventory comes flying back in. So I gotta admit, I was a little irritated at the time because I thought, you know, our job is to reduce inventory. But I listened to what he said, and we set up this, okay, inventory needs to go down, but product delivery needs to improve at the same time. So what do we do differently? And we decided to focus on something called cycle time. It used to take 18 weeks for a product to leave the warehouse, the factory to know, produce it, and get it back to the warehouse. We got that down to 2 weeks. And as a result, we cut inventory in half, saving $500 million, and delivery improved. So the sales force and customers were happy. And I found myself thinking, gee, see, that's kind of interesting. That's we're trying to basically accomplish two seemingly conflicting things at the same time. And I used to refer to it then as my any ninny theory, as in any ninny could do just one thing. You really needed to find out what that kind of opposing thing was and make sure that you accomplish both. And once I started looking for it, I saw it everywhere. And it was, you want a bunch of examples. It's, do you want people closest to the action empowered to make quick decisions? Or do you want good control so nothing bad happens? Do you want the economy reopened quickly so people get to work, or do you want everybody safe? Do you want functional costs to be lower in an organization, or do you want internal customer service to be better? In every case, you wanted both. Well, the thing that kind of struck me was that I thought this was an original, groundbreaking discovery that I had. And come to find out, it's not. I don't know how far back it goes, but I'm not the first person to observe this. So that kind of gets you to the next question that says, well, if this is known and has been known for a long time, why do so few people, organizations, companies do it? And the answer is because it's a lot tougher. Because you have to think about, okay, how do I affect both of these at the same time? Once you start looking for it and thinking about it and working that way, it's amazing how much better the results get. But whether you're a voter, an employee in a company, an employee in a nonprofit, all you ever want to know is, hey, boss, what's the one thing you want me to do? And as soon as a leader, you succumb to that, you're going to fall into that failure mode. And yes, you may get that one objective, but the other one is going to start to fall apart and create issues for you. So always look for those two seemingly conflicting things. The same is true when it comes to, do you want short-term results or long-term results? The media, CEOs, investors always want to pose it as it's a choice. They're mutually exclusive. You're one or the other. And the answer has to be no, you have to find a way to do both. And what are those root cause things you go after in order to be able to accomplish both? Once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of conversation about this everywhere in business, but you know, my mother had a saying, you can only genuflect in front of one altar. Was my mother wrong? So, you know, your primary focus is who? Your shareholders, your customers, your employees. I mean, this is one of the big conversations that's going on in business today, isn't it?
It is, and that's why in the book, what I tried to do is not provide just 200 pages of exhortations about why it's important, but rather be able to describe, well, how do you do it? How do you accomplish both? And that's why I talk about things like how do you grow sales and hold fixed costs constant? How do you build a culture that causes you to do both? How do you implement this kind of a culture or the kind of process work or the growth investments we talked about so that you don't tell your boss and investors, hey, it's going to be great in 5 years, but rather be able to keep those short-term improvements going so that everybody sees, yes, this is on the right path, and someday it's going to be even better. And what we try to do is just provide a lot of how do you actually do it, and not just, okay, you have to do it. This is how do you do it.
It's a tricky time to be a CEO, isn't it? These days, it's a tightrope. Are CEOs now pushed into the political arena more than one might be comfortable? Everything from Black Lives Matter to Me Too movement to U.S.-China relations. How difficult is it now from the CEO perch? And I guess is it harder because sometimes employees are demanding or let's say encouraging the leadership to speak out on these issues? Can you address that?
Yeah, I think people's expectations of what companies' roles are is getting more than a little carried away. And I think government likes it that way because it kind of takes the onus off of them to do the things that they ought to be doing and make it companies' responsibility. At the end of the day, the BRT issued a statement, I don't know, a year and a half ago or so, saying that, the Business Roundtable, that instead of being a share owner focus, it was a stakeholder focus. And I can remember at the time reading that and thinking, well, that's no big deal. If you're smart when it comes to share owners, you're doing the right thing already when it comes to communities, environment, employees, et cetera. Otherwise, in the long term, you're not doing the right thing for share owners either. And as an example, at Honeywell, at the same time that we went from 20 billion to 120 billion in market cap, I spent $10 billion remediating 100 years worth of environmental issues because it was the legacy Allied Chemical Company, asbestos issues, and making sure that we had a fully funded pension plan because I didn't want retirees or future retirees to run out of money at some point. But I did that as part of my focus on how do I do the right thing for the share owner in the long term. Well, that's gotten a little carried away to the point where now it's like share owners don't matter anymore, and it's all these other stakeholders that matter.
Like?
I think that's, when it comes to communities, employees, governments, speaking out on social issues, I think that gets a little carried away. And if we do, and businesses lose focus on what it is they're supposed to be doing, which is improving the productivity of the country and their companies on an ongoing basis and forever, we're going to see a reduction in our standard of living. Standard of living comes from productivity. Productivity comes from companies, no place else. Government does not generate productivity. They can enable companies to generate productivity, but they don't do it themselves. And if we start to lose sight of that and start to give CEOs excuses for why their performance isn't so good when it comes to share owners, but they're doing great in all these other areas, then we're going to start to see a decline in how our country performs. And I just don't think that's a good place to be. And, I read things like companies need to spend a lot more focus on making sure that kids are educated and working with the schools. Well, yeah, companies can play a role there, but it will be a very small role relative to what government ought to be doing. And I find our education system appalling when I look at what it is we're going to be facing in the 21st century. And I see all the discussion of racial justice, for example, which, I mean, who can be against that? It makes absolutely no sense. But everybody's focused on a lot of the short-term things. It's not to say that we shouldn't do them, adjusting criminal justice, how the police do their jobs, et cetera. But I would like to see a lot more discussion about the long-term side of this that says, all right, what should government do to have an education system that doesn't perpetuate socioeconomic classes where minorities tend to be overrepresented in the lower socioeconomic classes? What should government be doing to make sure that we're prepared to be successful in the 21st century, especially with China growing as a force in the world? And how do we use that to promote racial justice so that all kids, regardless of whether you're poor, white, rural, or poor, urban minority. I mean, wherever you are, you have that same kind of opportunity that I got coming out of a public school system in New Hampshire. And I'd like to see a lot more discussion of that with government saying, look, we bear a lot more responsibility here than businesses do. And I think government's done a great job here of putting the onus on companies when they ought to be kind of picking themselves up and going, you know, maybe we haven't done such a good job here. There's some other things we ought to be doing.
Okay. I fully agree with you. But let's talk about education for a minute. So you hire a young woman out of UNH. She's smart, she's ambitious, she's a real go-getter. Does she have enough education to power her through for the next 40 years? Or is there some, will she need to top off her educational tank several times through her career? I mean, is a 40 degree, is it, you know, even a master, is that enough now?
Well, I guess it depends on what it is you want to do and what you're trying to accomplish. The first thing I would say is whatever your education is, you should assume that that's not enough to last you 40 years. It doesn't mean, though, that you have to keep going back to school. There's a lot of different ways to learn. As you probably know, I stopped with my BS from what was WSBE at the time, the Whittemore School of Business and Economics. And personally, I hated school. I always felt like I was wasting my time, and there were other, you know, this is where I say I was ambitious but directionless. However, I'd like to say, I'm bragging a bit, I guess, but I've spent my whole life learning. And it's just by reading a lot, talking to as many people as I can. If there's something that I need to know more about, I get into it as much as I need to understand it. Forming judgment, the way we talked about, just by observing what other people are doing and did it work or not. There's a lot of different ways to learn beyond just going back to school. In some cases, you do have to go back to school. So if you're a programmer, for example, and you need to learn, you've been doing things a certain way for 3 years, and the world has changed in IT, which it does with periodic regularity, then it probably makes sense to go back and take a couple of courses to say, I just need to learn this stuff. Some people may look at it and say, geez, you know, I don't have the same kind of confidence in myself with a BS in business administration as I would if I went back and got my MBA. I would just feel better about myself because it'll give me a certain amount of self-confidence. Well, then you should go back and get your MBA. So it's not the perfect answer when it comes to, yeah, you know, always go back to school, but you have to figure out, how do I keep learning during the course of my career, and what's the best way to acquire that learning?
I just want to push back just a little bit on companies' roles. We've always thought, look, I had an internship myself that changed my life. What kind of responsibility do these companies have to take on interns and teach them some trades? And, you know, I'm not saying necessarily IBM, but a lot of these companies could certainly do more, don't you think?
Well, I'm going to kind of have a yes and no on that one. I would say if you're training for specific skill sets, then yes, there are things that companies are going to need to do. If you look at it and say, well, all companies should have internships to train kids in whatever it is the company is going to need for the good of society, yeah, that's okay to do. I'm not saying companies shouldn't do it, but we shouldn't look at that as a cure. That is a small, partial cure. And this, for me, gets back to education again, is I oftentimes say we have an education system designed by elitists for whom the system worked. And we look at stuff and say, well, this is how you teach algebra. And if somebody is probably not going to go to college, well, we teach algebra at a lower, slower rate. Well, there's nothing wrong. There's kids, and I'd say this probably happens a lot with boys, and I know I fell into that category. At 18, you don't want to keep going to school. You don't want to say, okay, you're going to be stuck in this education system, learning a low-level grade of algebra, which you are promptly going to forget. And then you can go to community college for 3 more years. That kid is sick of school already. So why can't we in high school teach differently? And if a kid says, geez, you know, I'd really like to be a carpenter. Well, instead of teaching algebra with formulas and word problems, what if we said, okay, if you want to be a carpenter, here's the math you need to know in order to be a good carpenter. So you want to design a set of stairs, which is not that easy, with steps and risers. Here's how you do it. Here's how you use math so that you can be a better carpenter. I don't see us really thinking about that anywhere. And I think we need a revamp of our education system. It worked fine when it was developed for the industrial age, where we needed just a certain amount of capability and education for people to be able to work in a factory. But our world is different now, and we've got online learning that we can use to have people learn at a different rate, not on just on their own, but at a different rate. We can start to do a better job of figuring out what's really going to float a kid's boat so that they want to learn. And I've got a great example in my own family with a nephew who quit high school as a freshman. He hated school, and he just was kind of a wild child, and there was no way it was ever going to accommodate him. And he wanted to do stuff with his hands. Well, he ends up getting his GED, going to Iraq, 1st Infantry Division on the run to Baghdad, so some tough experiences in there. Comes out, gets married, all of a sudden is having kids, and has that same kind of epiphany. He becomes a utility lineman, learns everything he needs to do that. Now he started his own company and is very successful. That story wasn't necessarily going to turn out that way.
Right.
If they could have found a way to accommodate him, and instead of saying, this is the system, you need to fit in this system, that might have worked 100 years ago where, okay, he went off on his own, could have probably still worked in a factory. That doesn't work anymore. And I'd like to see a lot more thought put into that kind of thinking when it comes to education, and not just telling everybody you got to go to college. And tell them, a bunch of them say, okay, if you just want to do this in high school, fine. Here's how we're going to help you.
Unless it's UNH. I do want to talk about, I do want to talk about that. As I said in the beginning, I got a lot of lessons for a university system. And as you know, universities now, for many reasons, are having to rethink their business model. You know, the pandemic or economic, what lessons can you take from all your years in business to the education of the university system? And then I want to turn it over to the students.
Yeah, I'd say universities, like government, would be, and Jim's probably cringing as I say this, but productivity is not something that's generally thought about. And the whole idea of, okay, how do I get the same output next year with less cost, less input? How do I make that happen? And there's a tendency to look at it and say, well, you know, I got 1,000 people. They all want 3% raises next year. So my budget has to go up at least 3% just to accommodate the raises. Well, the approach that I always took in Honeywell and in business was, okay, when somebody said, okay, I got 1,000 people, 3% raises, you want me to do these new things, I need another 5% there. So my budget needs to go up 8% next year. I used to say, okay, that's great. You had 1,000 people. Next year, I expect you to get all that stuff done, and you got 950 people. So figure out what you're going to do differently, what you're going to stop doing, what you're going to do more efficiently and more effectively. It's why we have a whole chapter in the book devoted to process, because any organization is just an accumulation of processes, all of which can be made more efficient and effective over time. And when it comes to universities, it seems to me we're heading into a crisis here because it's become unaffordable. Unaffordable whether government supports it or people have to pay for it. We refer to it now as a student debt crisis, when in reality, a lot of that is just because it's become too expensive. And we need to figure out a way to, it would be a great thing, I think, for a university to say, okay, you know, in 5 years, I want the cost of a four-year education here to be 2/3 of what it was, or what it is today. What do we need to do differently? That white sheet of paper type of exercise that I talk about in the book that says, start at what you'd like to see it be someday, and then fill in the spots on what it is we have to do. And I really don't see any universities, and definitely not government, ever even looking at it or thinking about it this way.
Deb, let's open it up to some, I asked you all the softball questions. Now you're going to get the real hard stuff from the students.
Softball is not a sport I ever associated you with, Susan. Hardball, maybe.
Thank you, Susan and Dave. It's been great listening to the two of you. And we do have a couple questions. So I'll start by the first one. I don't believe this is a student, Dave, and you may recognize this question. It starts by saying, can't promise any raises to your sister. How much do you credit GE training, Crotonville, Jack Welch, to changing your leadership perspective and success at Honeywell? And in parentheses, wish you had stayed at GE as I still own stock.
Well, assuming that's from Scott and that he is going to give my sister a raise, I'd have to say during the course of a career, you should be learning all the time. So yes, I learned a lot being at GE, but I would say the thing that ended up being more important was I kind of had a certain personality, and I thought some of this only came out later as my career developed. And I ended up, when I was talking to an early boss about a year or two ago, and just reaching out to him to say thanks for some of the guidance he gave me in the beginning, because I realized I'd done a poor job of ever thanking him for that, which, by the way, the same was true with Gene Savage at UNH. And he had these observations about me that I said, oh God, I thought that stuff had only developed later on. I didn't realize I had some of that in the beginning. And the point I'm trying to make is Jack Welch and GE created an environment where somebody like me could be successful, where that all that candor and bluntness that Susan talked about, and I'd say some of those New Hampshire values where you kind of tell things as you think they are and don't care what anybody else thinks, you're going to say what you think. He created an environment where that could be successful. And I don't think that was true of all big companies 40 years ago, and is still not true of a lot of big companies. So yes, I did learn a lot during those 25 years, learned at TRW and at Honeywell on an ongoing basis. But I'd say just as importantly is Jack was able to create an environment that was rare at the time, where someone like me could be successful in a big company.
That's great, thank you. Another question, this person was in the military, and he writes, in meetings, most of my commanders would ask for input from the most junior person first and work up. What do you think? Does that match with your meeting approach as you get more senior?
God almighty, you have no idea how much I love hearing that and knowing that our military works the same way. And I've often felt that a lot of good leadership lessons do come out of the military. And I've taught leadership classes at USMER, West Point. And one of the things that has struck me is whether it's the after action reports they talk about that they do, or the point that was just made, absolutely essential. And I talk about some of this in the book, where after I've gotten all the facts and opinions out from everybody, I would always start with the most junior person in the room. And before I had declared anything, I would say, okay, what do you think I ought to do? And it was always fascinating because in the beginning, the first thing they do is look at their boss. And their boss generally goes to answer for them. And I'd always put my hand out and say, no, I'll get to you. I want to know what this person thinks. And I'd work my way around the room. I would ask every single person in that meeting, working my way up to whoever was most senior involved in that decision, asking each of them what they thought I should do and why. And it was only when I got to the end of that that I would say, okay, here's my decision. And here's why. I would take the time to explain it. Because for the person who will say the decision goes against, that's not what they advocated, there's a tendency for people to say, well, you know, the guy just doesn't listen. With the idea being, well, if he had listened, he would have agreed. And I always wanted to explain the whole thing so that that person would sit there knowing, okay, he did listen. He just disagrees, and this is why. He decided to weigh this more than this, and that was the rationale. Because it encourages people to participate going forward because they know they're going to be listened to. But it also helps the organization learn. This is why he looked at things the way he did. You do that over time, and it's amazing. It gets much, much easier because people come in knowing, okay, I'm not just going to come in here and give all my stuff and then somebody makes a decision. I need to have a point of view when I go in there. And you do that long enough, you really train an organization to think. And it's the way I used to describe it as I wanted a thinking company. It's great to have a company that executes, but it's even better if they can execute after they've helped you think about what's the right thing to do. So I heartily endorse that approach, and I'm very gratified to hear our military does that.
That's great. And that was a great answer, Dave. Thank you for taking the time to go into that. So we have just a few more minutes left. We thought we'd get one more question on the table for you. One of the biggest challenges for new graduates or those looking to break into new industries is having a limited network and lack of experience. What advice would you give to those new graduates or those interested in changing careers in getting their foot in the door?
Yeah, that is difficult. And I would say it was doubly difficult for me because I had no idea how to go about it. So believe me, I can commiserate with what you're saying. That being said, it is what it is. And first thing I would suggest is talk to everybody. Everybody you run into, you talk to them about what it is you're trying to do, where you're trying to go, because you never know where these connections are going to get made. Read as much as you can. There's a lot more social media tools you can use today than there ever was before. Don't be afraid to ask. You got to be able to put yourself out there and let people know what it is you're interested in. And you never know where a connection's going to be made. Treat everybody with respect. As my dad used to say, the higher up you go up on the flagpole, the more people can see your ass. So be prepared for that, and always be thinking about, okay, how do I treat everyone with respect because they deserve it. Well, if you do that, it's really surprising how things can work out for you. And I mean, that's happened to me during the course of my career where someone I just happened to be nice to for no particular reason other than it was kind of my family and I'd like to think New Hampshire upbringing. And all of a sudden, 5 years later, it redounds to your benefit. And you didn't do it for that reason. It just does. So I would always just kind of keep those things in mind and reach out to as many people as you can. And the only reason I even got an exempt job at GE was I graduated from school. I was still working my punch press. There were no opportunities. And I'd seen this posting on the board, and it was for an exempt job as an accounts payable clerk. And I looked at it and walked away from it. And my lead hand came up to me about 4 hours later and said, geez, there's a job posted on the board. Why don't you apply for it? And I said, well, I don't know anything about accounts payable. Why should I be interviewing for that? And he looked at me and said, well, for crying out loud, you got a college education. Why wouldn't you at least try? Geez, good point. And I thought, you know, he kind of bucked me up a bit to say, okay, at least give it a try. Well, I didn't get that job, but I impressed enough people in the interview process that I managed to get a different job elsewhere near Boston and Lynn, Mass. So you never know where these things are going to grow. Listen to people, talk to them, reach out wherever you can to let them know what it is you are interested in.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Dave. And we're at the end of our session. So I'll say thank you to Dave Cody so much for being with us today. Thank you for Susan, your outstanding interview skills. This is a couple of times now that you and Dave have been together.
Well, before we go, I'd like to give Dave the opportunity to sing his favorite song with me, Ring of Fire by Johnny Cash. You want to do that, or you just want to, you just want to say goodbye?
Well, you having seen me do it, you know that I'm not going to do it unless I'm in the right kind of setting, because I am appalling. My voice is appalling.
Yeah.
All I'm grateful for, Susan, at least this time you didn't ask me if we dated in college, and you totally flummoxed me at the time, and it took me a month to realize I should have said, gee, if we had, I would have remembered.
Well, I would say one thing, that we would have had a lot more fun at UNH if we did know each other.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. It was another wonderful experience for our UNH alumni, our UNH students. Thanks to everyone who called in. Thanks to the E-Center at UNH for sponsoring. And a big thanks to the Boston Forum for all you did to get our attendance up. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks all.